Do you want to know how to play what I think is one of the most powerful characters in Frosthaven? Well, then stick around because we're going to be going through all the ins and outs of the Unlockable Meteor class. Obviously, spoilers for that class are going to follow, so if you don't want to know what's in that box, then don't watch this video. But if you do, we're going to dive into it right now. I said it once before, but final warning, spoilers are about to follow for the Unlockable Meteor class in Frosthaven. So if you don't want to hear those, peace out now. Still here? Good. Then we're about to talk about the Pyroclast. Pyroclast is a really interesting class. They are really built around generating hazardous terrain and obstacles. A lot of your abilities generate one or the other, or both of those, and many of your other abilities combo off of them, as long as they're on the board. They also have lots of powerful abilities that have trade-offs, so they may let you perform a really strong hit, but then you'll have a persistent card out that is hurting you in some way, either literally making you take damage every turn, or causing you to move more slowly, or decreasing your attack power. All kinds of different things, different debuffs that you have to deal with after using some of those powerful abilities. Quick note about my experience playing the Pyroclast. So far, I have played him with Snowflake, Coral, Shackles, and the Drifter. The only base class, not an unlockable class that I've played him with thus far is the Drifter. So that's my experience. I'm not going to get into detail about those other how he interacts with those other unlockable classes necessarily, because I don't want to spoil those. But if you know what those classes are, that might give you an idea of what my experience playing him has been like. One quick note about perks before we dive in here as well. The Pyroclast does have one really important perk that you're going to want to gun for right away. It's a 3-check perk that it's going to cost a total of 3 perk points to get it. But it's the perk at the bottom of your list there that says your hazardous terrain does not hurt you or your allies. Again, this character is going to be generating and relying on hazardous terrain a lot, so you can see how that might be really important. So much so that I would say spend every perk point you get on that until you unlock it, and don't worry about the others until you have that one in the bag. I'm going to also be uploading a build video going through your choices as you level up. That'll be a separate video, but I will say broadly, there are basically 2 paths that this class can go down. One which is dependent on and uses hazardous terrain. I refer to that as the lava build, and that's the one that I'm playing personally. And then a more defensive build that's a lot tankier, much more sort of in your face, in the middle of the fray, surrounded by enemies, and that build relies on generating and using obstacles for a lot of their abilities. So now that we've been through that, let's dive into the cards. So first up, we have Cloud of Ash. Cloud of Ash is going to be a really bread and butter card for the Rock Pyroclast build, but it's still useful for both classes. It's just a bit more situational if you're going with the Lava build. It's relatively speedy with an initiative of 23. The top half lets you explode an obstacle tile at a range of 4 and deal a 1 damage attack to all adjacent enemies. Importantly, this is an actual attack, not flat damage. So you actually get to draw a card from your modifier deck for each enemy you hit. That means you're not necessarily going to do just 1 damage, you can do more. You also get to push all of those enemies away from the blast zone, 1 space for each enemy you hit, and you get to muddle them. Finally, you'll generate a leaf and gain 1 XP. It's an extremely useful top half as long as you have a ready supply of obstacles. So that's what I meant by it being a little more situational. It's not great against shielded enemies, since these are attacks, not direct damage, but it can still be useful since you're pushing them. The bottom half is a pretty useful movement of 3, with the option to replace 1 or 2 hazardous terrain tiles with obstacles. Again, this is a great combo with the Rock Pyroclast. You're going to need ways to generate the terrain that you use, and this is a great way to add some more obstacles onto the field for you to make use of later. Next up we have Cooling. Cooling is a must-have card, especially at early levels. Simply because it's a really solid heal, and it's the only one you have access to for a while. It'll probably have some more legs for a Rock Pyroclast, thanks to the top half, which lets you replace a hazardous terrain tile at range 4 with an obstacle. All adjacent enemies suffer 2 damage, and you generate a leaf and gain XP. This has obvious synergies with something like our first card, Cloud of Ash. Plus, it's a great option for dealing with shielded enemies, because unlike Cloud of Ash, this is direct damage, not an attack, so it will ignore shields. This is a slow card with an initiative of 75, but that can actually come in handy, especially for the bottom half. The bottom half of the card is your only real healing option when you start out. It's a nice one, though, with a self-heal of 5. It comes with a trade-off in the form of another key mechanic for the Pyroclast, debuffs. We talked about these up top, these debuffs that you're going to have to put out as a persistent thing that are going to cause some sort of negative effect for your character. Once you perform the heal, the card remains active and you must place a counter on it. Your next 3 move abilities will have a -1 movement. You can't voluntarily discard these cards either, the way you can with most other classes that have positive buffs. But again, it's your best and only heal to start with, so for that reason alone, it's worth taking this card. Next up, we have Eruption. The initiative on Eruption isn't great, with a very middle-of-the-road 47, meaning it can sometimes be hard to get this in the order where you want it. The top half of the card is a great resource builder, though, regardless of which type of Pyroclast build you're going for. You create an obstacle in an empty hex at a ridiculous range of 5. Then you create hazardous terrain in any unoccupied hexes around that obstacle and cause anyone occupying those hexes to immediately suffer 4 damage. Again, this is direct damage, so great for chewing through shielded enemies. You do have to be careful with this one though, as it will also damage any party members who happen to be in one of those occupied hexes. Finally, you generate Fire and Leaf, earn 2 XP, and lose the card. Yes, it's a burner, so you do want to pick the time to deploy this carefully, but having a reliable way to generate hazardous terrain and obstacles on demand is clutch. The bottom half is a standard attack of 2 that also generates fire. Nothing special to see here, move along. Flowing Fire is our next card, and it is definitely a must-have. A nice and speedy initiative of 20 means you'll be going before most enemies. The top half is a very solid attack of 2 on 3 different hexes in a straight line from your character. But things get really interesting if you have a fire element you can consume. At that point, you get to place hazardous terrain in each empty hex targeted by the ability. In fact, you actually consume the fire after the attack happens. So if you happen to draw a push from your modifier deck, or you just kill the enemy outright, and they're no longer there when you consume the fire, well, then you can actually get 3 total hazards out with this bad boy, which is great. Now, my own personal use case, I would usually use this on an enemy with the middle target to generate hazardous terrain on either side of them. But on the rare instance when you can get a push or kill an enemy with it, getting an extra hazardous terrain out with it is pretty great. And if the top half weren't enough to convince you to take the card, the bottom half should be. An astounding move of 6. That's right, 6 total movement. The drawback being that you're going to suffer 1 damage now and at the start of your next 2 turns. That's a price I'm usually willing to pay for that much movement. This is probably one of the most used cards in my deck. Take it. Now we get to our next really big resource generator aside from Eruption. We're going to be looking at Igneous Path. At 18, Igneous Path is your fastest level 1 card, not counting X cards. The top half is another loss, but it's also another great resource generator. In fact, I would argue that the card is key if you're going for a Lava Pyroclast build. It lets you designate a hex at range 4 and fill that hex and all hexes on a direct path to it with hazardous terrain. Anyone occupying one of those hexes will also suffer 3 damage. You'll gain 1 XP for each figure that you damaged and generate fire. Again, you have to be careful with this one because you can hurt other party members. Plus, it's a burner, but I use this card frequently once my party gets to the final room in a scenario. It's a great way to quickly fill a room with hazardous terrain. The bottom half of this card may seem underwhelming at first, a measly move of 1, but you can consume fire to add another movement. Plus, you get to leave a trail of hazardous terrain behind you when you move. This ability synergizes nicely with anything that gives you bonus movement, including some other character abilities. With bonus movement, you can literally leave a trail of destruction behind you. I can't stress this enough. The bottom half of this card is a lot more useful than people realize, especially if you have boots and other ways to increase your movement points. You can really generate a ton of hazardous terrain all at once with this card. The next card we're going to look at is Lava Bomb. I called them a Lava Pyroclast for a reason. If you're going down that path, this card is your meat and potatoes. It's not very exciting, but it's reliable and does what you need it to, when you need it to. Much like the rest of the card, the initiative is pretty uninspiring at 53. The top half is a pretty straightforward attack of 2 at range 3, but you also get to place hazardous terrain underneath the target of the attack. Finally, you generate a fire. Again, not a super impressive attack, and you only get to place 1 hazardous terrain tile, but it's a reliable way to get hazardous terrain out without consuming an element or burning a card. The bottom half is a good movement of 4, even if that doesn't seem very exciting now that we've seen our move 6 card. Again, everything on this card is good. Not great, but good, and so I suggest you take it. Again, it's a little underappreciated. It puts in a lot of good regular work, while flashier cards get all of the attention. Next up, we're going to look at Liquid Stone. What's a useful ability for a character that generates lots of hazardous terrain? How about a push? A reasonably fast initiative of 28. The top half of Liquid Stone is an attack of 3 with a push. Attack of 3 is already solid, but if you can push an enemy through some hazardous terrain while you're at it, that's a lot of potential bonus damage. The bottom half is a respectable move of 3, but you also get to push an enemy that's adjacent to the hex you stop in for 1. Again, great for repositioning or getting some extra damage from pushing them into hazardous terrain. Additionally, you can consume a leaf to increase your push distance by 2 and gain an XP. Next up, we have Melted Armor. Melted Armor is one of our slow cards with an initiative of 62, but it packs a punch. The top half is an attack of 3, but we get to add 1 damage, a pierce of 3, and gain 1 XP if the target is occupying hazardous terrain. Now we're starting to get those combos. We're also starting to get an appreciation of all the different ways this class has of dealing with shielded enemies. Finally, you generate fire. The bottom half is a strange one. At first glance, it doesn't seem very useful. You get to add +1 damage to your next 3 attacks, but as long as the card is active, you're also going to take +1 damage from every attack targeting you. This seems like an especially crappy debuff to have out. The key here is not to let it stay out. Instead, you want to use this ability when you have an attack lined up that's going to hit multiple enemies or trigger multiple times. That way you trigger all of the bonuses and discard the card before any of the enemies have a chance to hit you. This pairs nicely with Flowing Fire or any AoE attack. Our next card is Quenched Rage. Fast, but not too fast, at an initiative of 30. If you needed more of a hint that you should be pushing and pulling enemies, here it is. The top half of the card is a push of 3. That's it, no attack, just a push of 3. However, if you have a leaf to consume, this gets extra spicy. You get to double the damage of any hazardous terrain you just pushed an enemy through. Then you replace that hazardous terrain with obstacles. This makes the top half great for Lava Pyroclasts because it doubles the damage of hazardous terrain, and great for Stone Pyroclasts because it creates a bunch of obstacles. It's highly dependent on a leaf element, but you have lots of ways of generating those, like the bottom half of this card. The bottom half is a bit like the bottom half of Melted Armor. You're going to deal -1 damage on your next 3 attacks, but you get to double the damage of the 4th attack and gain an XP. Again, this pairs nicely with an AoE attack. Burn through the negatives with several small attacks, then save up for 1 really big wallop on a boss or elite. Finally, we're going to look at our slowest level 1 card, Under Pressure. The initiative of 85 on Under Pressure is actually pretty useful, since it's a loot card. Being able to play it late in the round can be very helpful. The top half of Under Pressure is a must-have card for a Rock Pyroclast. A 3 damage attack, but you get to add plus 2 damage and gain an XP if the target is adjacent to at least 2 obstacles, walls, or objectives. The bottom half is a must-have card for any Pyroclast. Again, it's your loot card. The nice thing here is that in addition to your loot action, any adjacent enemies will also suffer a damage, and you generate a leaf. Not a lot more to say about this one. You should obviously keep this thing with you, simply because it's your loot card. Now let's take a look at our level X cards. Remember when I said Igneous Path was our fastest level 1 card? Technically true, because I wasn't counting level X cards. Like our first one here, Force of Earth is insanely fast with an initiative of 15. You've had lots of push cards up to this point, but the top half of Force of Earth is your first pull card. An attack of 1 at range 3 with a pull for 2 and a muddle. Let's talk about masteries for a second. You may have noticed that one of yours requires you to move an enemy through 6 individual hazardous terrain tiles in a single turn. Seems impossible. And it sort of is with your basic cards. The difference here is you're eventually going to unlock some cards for your modifier deck that allow you to push enemies. Combine that with some of your pull and push abilities, and suddenly this becomes a lot more possible. Outside of the pull, there's not much to remark on for the top half of this card. The bottom half is very appealing for a rock Pyroclast. Destroy an adjacent obstacle and the next 2 hills targeting you get +1. You might be starting to see that if you want to be a little more in-your-face and tanky, Rock Pyroclast is the way to go. And that trend is going to continue with our next level X card, Metamorphic Rock. A slower card at 68, Metamorphic Rock is another great choice for Rock Pyroclasts. The top half gives you a straight shield and retaliate of 1 each and generates a leaf. It's a burner, but it's also a persistent buff, meaning once you get this up, you've got 1 shield and retaliate until the scenario ends or you intentionally toss the card. Plus, you get 2 XP for your trouble. Again, a great bonus if you intend to be on the front lines. The bottom half gives you the one and only way you have to more quickly get rid of those pesky debuffs. You get to move the token of one of your persistent abilities forward. And since most of your persistent abilities are bad, this is a nice treat. Plus, you get a decent move of 3. Finally, let's take a look at what I think is the most skippable of your level X cards, Wildfire. Wildfire is the most quintessential level X card of the bunch. It's very slow at initiative 72, and it's extremely situational. The top half lets you destroy an adjacent hazardous terrain tile to add bleed, poison, and generate a fire element on your next 3 attacks. Not bad if you're gathering enough hazardous terrain to feel like you can burn one. Plus, the usefulness of bleed and poison will be highly scenario dependent. The same could be said for the bottom half. A move of 4 is decent, but you're also going to place a wound on yourself and 2 adjacent enemies wherever you stop. Again, situationally useful, but there are probably better cards you can take. So let's take a look at our 2 starting builds. As a Lava Pyroclast, you're going to want to take most of your level 1 cards, with the exception of Cloud of Ash. Instead, you'll take Metamorphic Rock, which will be more useful to you in most situations, especially for the debuff mitigation on the bottom. Unless you're heading into a scenario with a lot of obstacles, in which case you might want to consider swapping that out for Cloud of Ash. As a Rock Pyroclast, you're also going to take most of your level 1 cards, with the exception of Lava Bomb and Melted Armor. Those 2 are more useful for the Lava Pyroclast, so instead you'll take Metamorphic Rock and Force of the Earth for the extra healing from destroyed obstacles. Both of those cards should complement your tankier playstyle. Next up, I'll be taking a look at your level 2 through 9 cards and making some recommendations on what you might want to think about, depending on which build you're planning on going down. Until then, I hope this has been helpful. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.